thank you all for coming in tonight, and thank you, James, for travelling down to be with us.
Thank you.
I first met James when he was writing a play loosely about Edward Snowden.
Yes.
And I was subjected to his interview technique, where he comes in and has no pen or notepad and just is a very sympathetic listener, and you tell him far more than you want to tell him. And he wrote a play called Privacy on the back of that. But I've watched his sort of stellar career ever since, in which he's become one of the most in-demand playwrights in this country, with a particular theme which he's mined, which is the playwright of politics, or a political playwright. So we'll discuss what that means. But I mean, you were born in Mansfield,
yes,
which is a mining community, in 1982, and you had your first typewriter at the age of 4.
4, yeah.
I learn.
Very good. How do you know that? Were you there? That's so strange.
Because
I don't remember saying that.
I do my research. Where did that come from, and where did this urge to record and to write emerge, or did it?
I don't. Can you hear me? Is that on? Very good. I thought you might be able to hear me over my shirt. I'm sorry. I thought I would try and look like a playwright. I think
you do.
It definitely didn't. Theatre, for me, like probably a lot of you, unfortunately just wasn't part of my growing up. It wasn't part of my life. It was a working class town and a working class family, but we had... I was, for whatever reason, obsessed by story and television dramas and films and books. So I started thinking I was going to be a novelist at the age of 4 and just churning out these stories to give to my mum and my dad to read. And honestly, it was school plays. I had such a good... I went to a comprehensive school in North Nottinghamshire, and they just had an incredible working theatre, and they were committed to the idea that kids from these kinds of backgrounds should do plays, and there was a philosophy in the school whereby, you know, they dragged in the footballers from off the field and said, you're going to be Romeo and you're going to do this and it's going to be good. And so from that, I just really enjoyed, it's an obvious thing to say, but the liveliness of theatre, the sense of event, the sense of community, the connection with an audience, and the chemistry that happens in a space, in a physical space that you don't get in any other medium. So I went off to study drama at university and started writing plays from there on in.
And what kind of plays were your early plays about? I mean, what was the subject matter?
I think it's a complete accident that I've fallen into becoming a political playwright. I don't think I'm any more politicised than any normal person. But so I came from a mining town, so the first play I tried to write was based on testimonies and interviews I did from people in my town about the strike. I was only 2 years old when that happened. So I wrote a pretty bad play about the miner strike that was framed entirely by the event. It began when the miner strike began, and it ended when the miner strike ended. And in between, I wrote stuff and bad jokes, and we took that to the Edinburgh Festival. But I guess either through that or that revealed a desire to try and use history as a way to interrogate often Britishness and obsession with this island and its post-war history. And I also just love history, actually. And actually, my love of politics mainly comes through that. The first time I would have heard terms like capitalism or Marxism came through a study of it in the past. And I loved historical films from George III to Schindler's List. I just enjoyed going on a narrative, emotional journey to make sense of the past.
So I think the first time I sort of really clocked you was a play called This House, which took, to me, the most unpromising subject you could possibly imagine, which was the dying days of the Callaghan government.
Yeah, it's sexy, it's good stuff.
Yeah, but I mean, but at the time you thought, that was sort of, rats in the streets, and it was the sort of dying days of a form of Labour government that had been around for whatever, 15 years, 18 years. But what I learnt about you is that you often come into a subject very laterally.
Right.
So I think you were born 3 years after the events, so you didn't live that. So how on earth did that pique your interest, that you thought that would be a good subject for a play?
Cynically, so this was a play that went on at the National Theatre in London in 2012, and then it's had a life ever since. But it was very brutally. We had the hung Parliament in 2010, And as we are all familiar, that our democratic system isn't really designed to tolerate that. It's designed to produce a majority government to pursue a single policy program. And I got really excited about trying to understand how that particularly the House of Commons, which is a building architecturally designed around government and opposition and not designed for cross-party collaboration, how it's going to work. So a few days after the 2010 election, I went to the National Theatre, and I imagined in my head a line of great playwrights from David Hare to Tom Stoppard lining up to tackle it. And I just sort of wanted to throw my hat in the ring. And I decided to try and approach it in the way that I had been doing quite a lot in smaller venues, which was to find a past equivalent in order to make sense of the current. And theatres, that's not my idea, that's what Shakespeare did and the Greeks did. And I'm not saying I'm the only one after that, but it's us three, we're doing it. And it's just very helpful. It's just very helpful to provide perspective on something that feels very close. The greatest political play for me of all time is for that reason, is The Crucible by Arthur Miller. Arthur Miller could have written a verbatim, urgent piece about the McCarthy trials in the 1950s, and it would have been close and sexy and dangerous. But what he decided to do was to find a metaphorical, allegorical equivalent. And there's a reason why The Crucible is now being performed for hundreds of years, because of the broader, universal themes that naturally come out of that process. So it's a bit of a cheat. You elevate your plays accidentally to the heights of metaphor, and people go, "Well, that's so clever, you've done that." You sort of go, "Sort of not," and I just realised, I suppose ultimately that, for those of you who don't know, I wasn't alive, so I didn't know that Parliament, 74 to 79, which was previously the last time we'd had a hung Parliament, was the most dramatic and chaotic, I think, in modern British history. It was the age of because they had no majority, they were just absolute scenes of madness whereby every single vote was maybe going to be won or lost by one or two. And you might have heard of the system called pairing, which is a gentleman's agreement, whereby if, for example, you can't make a crucial vote because you're on ministerial business or something personal, like somebody you know isn't very well, there's an honour code whereby I say, well, I would have voted the different way from you, so I'll just step out and I cancel out your absence by not voting. And it's in an indecent world, it's quite a decent thing to do. It's currently been cancelled recently, which suggests a lot about the decency levels of our current Parliament. But that collapsed in the 1970s as well. So there were scenes of ambulances having to turn up in New Palace Yard with people who were sick and dying in hospital. And one of the strange conventions in Parliament as well is this thing called nodding through, where as long as you are on the palace grounds, if for whatever reason you can't walk, you can't pass your body by the teller to be counted, you can be nodded through as long as two whips from other parties come and check that you're alive. And so when you read that, you think, well, that's insane. And you want to try and understand the conditions by which that has been allowed to happen. And there was an example sometimes when they would go out and they would go down the ambulances and the whips would have an argument about how alive somebody was and whether or not their vote could be counted. So you think, well, that's a gift for a writer, and as a writer who really wants to try and put our institutions on stage in order to examine their processes and make sense of them, I just thought we have to look at that. And actually, the truth is, it started with me hearing a story about the vote of no confidence in 1979, which was the vote that the last time we had a motion of confidence recently, as you'll know, against Theresa May's government. It's the last time a vote of no confidence destroyed a government and forced them to go to a general election. And it destroyed Callaghan and produced Margaret Thatcher. So obviously that's a key moment in British history anyway, the turning from that to that. But I discovered it was only passed by one single vote. And it's often attributed to a person, an MP, a Labour MP, who was sick and dying in Leeds, and he couldn't make it down. And that was a single vote that meant history turned and Thatcher arrived. And we can agree or disagree that she would have got in anyway. But I heard that, and I heard the conversations that the party were having about, should we try and bring him down? It's likely he might die on the way. Is that a good look? Probably not. And you go, well, generally speaking, what kind of democratic system gets to the point when you're going, should we kill someone on the M1 to save the government? And also, what are the 5 years leading up to that moment that meant that the survival of the government was so dramatic? So I guess it was all those things. But it's a fundamental, to answer your question in a long way, it's a fundamental geeky desire I have to make sense of bigger, broader subject matters by drilling down on process and rituals and systems to illuminate, I think, sort of wider truths.
So there are two interesting things about that play. I mean, one is, which seems to be a feature of your work, that quite often it's not the main characters that interest you. So it's not about Callahan and Thatcher, it's about what goes on in the whip's office, which is, you'd think, even nerdier than the subject matter. And the second is, which, again, I'd like to just sort of begin by talking about, is, I mean, you could have written that story. There are enough accounts in the public domain about that, but to what extent were you interested in talking to and getting your own first-hand accounts in order to write something that was, and I'm going to put this word in inverted commas, real?
Yes.
So to what extent was that kind of research so that you get your version of it?
Yeah, really important. And actually, there wasn't a huge amount of information about it before I started. Normally when you start a new play, there's a process that happens that you go on Amazon and you try and see if there are any books available on the subject matter. And your first instinct when you see that there are no books about it, you go, oh my God, yes, I found something. And then you go, shit, there's no books about it. How am I going to write the play? And so I had to go out, and famously, whips have a code of conduct, again, whereby they try not to, they're not allowed to, when they are whips, they're not allowed to speak in the House of Commons, they're not allowed to ask a question, they're not allowed to give interviews. So it's incredibly hard to know what goes on in these offices, and sorry to patronise you, for those who don't know what the whips do, they're members of Parliament who, either the government or the opposition, there's a dozen or so of them, they work together in the bowels of Parliament to put party business through the House, and they tell their members of Parliament which way to vote depending on the leadership's policy, and if there are rebels, they're the guys or girls who have to go and either use encouragement or intimidation to get people through. And in this particular period, it was very masculine and very brutal. So there were stories of whips throwing people up against the wall. There was a moment when one whip half dangled Neil Kinnock over the balustrade into the Thames and said, "You will vote this way." It was very aggressive. Jack Straw has a story about being squeezed in a certain region of his body until he agreed. It's sort of, I mean, it's hilarious and horrific that's and obviously that would never happen now. So they don't generally talk about it. And the first person to publish basically a memoir about whipping was Giles Brandreth, and he famously, on the day of publication, I think, he got a little card through the post with a little black spot on it, which was all it was. And it was basically saying, "You're out, you're done, that's it." So when I knock on the door and say, "Can you talk to me?" They weren't necessarily massively inclined to do that. And it took a long time. It took a long time to build their trust. And the first person I spoke to was Anne Taylor, who was a whip. She was a 26-year-old whip in this very male world. And she became the first female chief whip under Tony Blair. She, for whatever reason, relented. And then they started to sort of knock on her from there. And I don't pretend I'm a journalist. I don't want to be a journalist ever. But even though I really, really respect journalists, I really do. But I don't see that as my job. And actually, some of the I'm sure we'll get onto this. Some of the criticisms about doing the Brexit Cumberbatch film were isn't that journalism's job to expose that truth? So I think it's a different thing. But I do enjoy that process.
But I mean, in praise of you, there was a recent film about James on the BBC with Alan Yentob, and Anne Taylor was there, saying that she had told you far too much because you were so charming to her. But then she said it was absolutely astonishing because there you were, this 30-year-old playwright, and you had exactly captured the atmosphere in the whips room of events before you were even born. So that was, quotes, real. Yes.
I don't think theatre necessarily has an obligation or a responsibility to be too real. It is art, and it has to function and satisfy on an artistic level. And the language of theatre is particularly different from the language of television. As you know, television is a more literal medium, and there is a different level of responsibility, I think, to if you're purporting towards naturalism in TV drama, you have a different responsibility to truth and realness. In theatre, you can do whatever you you sort of like. It's an expressionistic medium, and there's some leeway there.
Well, just talk me through that, because if we're writing about Bolingbroke and Henry IV and people, you think, well, that's fine, that all happened a long time ago, but you were putting words into the mouths of people, some of whom are still alive, about events that were very recent. So if I'm coming in to see this house, what do you want me to think that I'm seeing? That this is a fictionalization, an imaginary version, or what do you want people to think they're seeing?
I definitely would think I want them to think a version of this happened. This is the truth. There was a parliament that was hung. People behaved in this kind of way. But also, and you don't even. I sort of loathe those cards that lawyers force us to put at the beginning of all TV drama that says this is inspired by real events, but some of the dialogue has been imagined. And you think, but when an audience knows that, you know that when you know that I wasn't there in that meeting in the 1970s. So you know that to a certain extent, I'm having to imagine, based on as much available research as possible, what was said. I suppose I just mean specifically for theatre. There is an abstraction. There is a theatricality that elevates it necessarily from naturalism, and also the definition of being in the space. You're in the space with the actor. You know that actor isn't really Michael Heseltine, and so there is a different contract with an audience that allows you to find, sorry to be pretentious, but a different kind of truth. And I know that's a dangerous thing to say in the age of post-truth, but you're asking a different question. The proposition is different.
I've never interviewed David Hare about this, but David Hare writes in sort of similar kinds of territory. They're plays about recent things. He sometimes writes about the Labour Party, but my impression of the way that he works is to actually go in with a tape recorder, get a transcript done up, and then they're what known as verbatim plays.
Yes, yeah.
So that is a sort of different kind of truth from the truth that you're presenting.
It is, and I just made a policy decision very early on that when I would go and interview real people, I wouldn't record them, and again, because I'm not a journalist, because I'm not looking for quotes, and it's what I'm looking for is to feel something about themselves, as the essence of their character. I'll make notes, but it's crudely as well. It's a tactic, because people see that line going on your iPhone, and they see that every time they speak, the thing jumps, and something happens to them where they feel less able to be liberal with their thoughts. Whereas, with Anne Taylor and whips like that over the course of a couple of hours and possibly a couple of drinks, you open up a different kind of conversation that is more reflective and general. And I think, I just want them to trust me that I'm not trying to get a gotcha. I'm not trying to trip them up and get them to say something that I can then quote out of context.
And I'm just going to press you on this a tiny bit, because you used the word "the truth,"
yes,
which is a big word. So what kind of truth do you think you are able to tell in the theatre that a journalist couldn't tell or a historian couldn't tell?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And I think, well, I'll get overly romantic about and slightly self-aggrandizing about, I think, the power of theatre and storytelling. But I think what you're asking the audience to go through is a different thing to someone reading a newspaper. The responsibility of journalism is to hold power to account and to as urgently, as quickly as possible, relay facts to people. And that happens on a daily basis, and you constantly receive this information. The proposition of a story is different in that you're asking people to walk through the shoes of your characters and try and empathize and understand what may motivate and drive them. And that's a different thing. So when I put a whip on stage, I just think ultimately we have an empathy deficit in our politics and in our public discourse at the moment. And theatre's function might be to go sometimes against your prejudices. I did a play recently about Rupert Murdoch, and I tried to humanize him, and that was apparently very controversial. But I wanted to understand what drove him and motivated him. And so I was very satisfied that an audience, and this play was staged in Islington. I think it was actually Jeremy Corbyn's constituency, and not many people in the audience bought The Sun. And they came into the play quite excited because it's a play, so it must be really left-wing. And they were really excited to draw blood from Murdoch. And I didn't satisfy them on that level. I didn't want to. And actually in the interval of the play, so people were coming out sort of grey and horrified, and they were saying things like, oh my God, I think I like Rupert Murdoch. And I think bar sales went up in the interval because people were just sort of necking it. And I'm thrilled. I'm thrilled with the mischievousness of that, because what I want them to do is find an empathy for a position opposite to theirs, which isn't really answering your question about truth, but that is possibly the power of drama that journalism can't
It's an interesting question about how you arrive at truth. And your next play, well, one of your next plays was another play about the Labour Party, Labour of Love.
Yeah.
And again, the Labour politicians who were around at the time say this was a very accurate presentation of what was going on. And again, in this film about you, Nick Robinson, the BBC former political editor, was interviewed, and you obviously know him, and I'm assuming he knows you.
I would met, yeah.
Well, he sort of put you on the psychiatrist's couch a bit,
yes, yeah.
And he speculated that your parents split up when you were young, that your parents had different political viewpoints, and that from a young age you became accustomed to having two people in your life who you loved and respected, who had different views, and therefore it became part of your mentality to understand how people you respected could have two different. And so therefore in your writing, it's often your approach is to try and understand every point of view. Did that ring true when Nick said that on the program?
It was very
Maybe
weird.
Maybe you told him that.
Say this, no. It did ring true. I'm very aware that I might be the wrong political playwright for our times, and I fully accept that, because I don't really have an agenda. I don't use theatre as a form of activism. I'm not looking for specific change or to promote a specific agenda in the way that, I think even to be fair to David here, he would say he often wants to celebrate or promote a certain part of the political spectrum, normally left-wing. Truthfully, I just find it dramatically and politically inert to do that, to say, here's my point of view, you probably agree, here's why, I'm going to answer the question for you. And I find it more exciting to make the proposition, to put the question on stage, but to try and leave it unanswered, and I just find it's more dramatically interesting anyway. And it goes back to the empathy thing. So even people who have different politics to me, I enjoy the exercise in playing devil's advocate with my prejudices and going, what's the most generous version I can think of about why Rupert Murdoch does what he does? And I happen to think, especially in this reasonably toxic age, that's quite a healthy exercise to do. It also just happens to, I think, create more interesting characters, three-dimensional characters with strengths and weaknesses and flaws that an audience can engage with.
You refer to the play about Murdoch, which is called Ink, as another origin story. So
yes,
I think in your telling, you thought about populism today, and then you thought, well, where did that start? And that took you back to 1968, when Murdoch bought a paper that was called The Sun, which was a rather dull, failing broadsheet paper owned by IPC, and in the space of a year transformed it into... Do you want to just talk about why that moment was the origin for you of
it's become another accidental trick of mine, but to try and not trick, I'm being unfair on myself, but a way of assessing the current political anxieties of the day, whatever they may be, and trying to sort of walk backwards through history to see one of the places where it might have started. And that's why, I refer to them as origin stories, because I think we like that. We like that in cinema, we like that in film, to go to prequels and go, how did Darth Vader become Darth Vader? Here he is as a little boy. And we enjoy the dramatic irony of that, of knowing more than the characters know and knowing where we end up. So during Brexit and the Trump campaign, like everyone, I was really interested in how the rhetoric of political conversation and news media felt like it was changing, or had been changing for a while and was now manifesting itself as something very populist and quite aggressive. And you have this story of which I heard, I don't know how you hear these stories, but you sort of collect them and use them as weapons later on. The buying of the Sun newspaper by Rupert Murdoch, where he first arrived on Fleet Street in the 1960s. And it's kind of a gift as well, because you get to take people who you know are very powerful establishment figures, and you present them as younger men or women when they're sort of outsiders and they have all the uncertainties and the doubts about themselves, and it naturally just makes them more attractive because they seem very human and they haven't quite got to the place that you know they get to. So to see Rupert Murdoch as a disruptor, a young, reckless disruptor wanting to come into a very old industry and shake it up in a pre-Zuckerbergian kind of way, I think naturally creates a sort of attraction. But the story itself of the first year of the sun is brilliantly neat and remarkable in that, and I do really like boundaries and settings. So I loved this house because it was a 5-year contained parliament. I enjoyed the Brexit movie because it was the course of a campaign that begins and ends, and you can contain the ideas within that. So this was the first year of the sun, and by happenstance, to celebrate the first year anniversary of the sun, they where the sales figures had rocketed up. They came up with the idea of we should celebrate it by getting a girl to take her clothes off and put her on page 3, and she's wearing her birthday suit to celebrate the birthday. And out of that was born the phenomenon that is page 3, the very strange bizarreness of naked women in a family newspaper that seemed to be so un-British in its rawness. So you have that as the end point, and you have the beginning point, and you try and chart that journey for a paper and a country and a culture that arrives at a point that used to be incredibly reverential and deferent, and ends up with breasts on page 3. And between that, you sort of chart the course of that. And also, there were incredible things. There was an astonishing kidnap and murder story within the course of that year of the chairman's wife of the Sun, where the people who kidnapped her argued that the Sun was poisoning Britain with this new kind of populist tabloid, and whether or not that was the reason for their decision to kidnap her or not. But the Sun was faced with what, from a writer's point of view, is an incredible crisis, a moral and emotional crisis, in that how do they report the story of one of their own being kidnapped, and the police argued with them quite a lot to not give too much information away, and so you have this huge moral quandary, and they did publish quite a lot of their inside information, and there was a criticism from other papers and the police that they had exacerbated her eventual murder, and so as a dramatist you think, well, that's again much like the ambulances in New Palace Yard. You think this incredible thing erupts out of a story, and you just want to understand what conditions were set to mean something so extraordinary and unreal happens as a result.
Because you've referred to how many people found the Murdoch character surprisingly attractive, and the sad figure in the story is Hugh Cudlip, who's a great figure of tabloid journalism, old working class Labour man who had built a sort of honourable Daily Mirror and wanted to have an almost Reithian view of stretching the working class and giving them something to feed their brains, and yet his son was a pallid thing compared with the version that Murdoch created. Yes. And in your play, Cudlip is sort of out of touch, bumbling, out of time, and just can't match this demonic figure that you create of Murdoch.
Yeah, well, so he's the old. They didn't realise that the world was about to change, but he was the old guard. He believed, as you say, in a Reithian style of journalism that was to educate and entertain. The sales figures, it was the most popular paper in the English-speaking world at the time. And in comes this Aussie and these guys, and they changed the culture of Fleet Street really quickly over 12 months. To the point with which Hugh Cudlip eventually lost his job and was replaced, and his empire and worldview became the past. So those, if you can always represent philosophically opposite forces in the form of a character relationship, that's really exciting as well. I hope I didn't make him too bumbling and ineffectual, but it's just his contrast to Murdoch's confidence and brashness was quite stark.
Rupert Murdoch came to see it.
He did.
What did he make of it?
Well, it's a funny thing, isn't it? Because as on a human level, you have a genuine desire to not misrepresent him. So you want him to like it to the point where you think you've been fair on him. But you also don't want him to like it too much. You really don't, because then you've not done your job. So it's a funny thing. But no, I was very, very nervous. Obviously, he'd sent a lot of his people. Rebecca Brooks came, Kelvin McKenzie came, people from his American papers all came to see it and sort of said, it's okay, this is probably as good as you're going to get. So you should probably go and enjoy it. And he came on the sort of the second to last night of the West End run when it transferred to the West End. It was, I mean, unfortunately, when I was waiting for him backstage, sort of shaking. I couldn't bear being in the theatre watching it with him. And I thought, well, at least, no matter what happens, even if he yells at you or sets the lawyers onto you, it's a great dinner party story, or it's a great story to tell in a lecture hall. The problem is, I was so scared and couldn't believe quite what was happening. I can't remember almost anything he said. I remember he asked me very specifically. He sort of shook my hand and said, and then he asked very specifically where I got some information about the criticism of the coverage of that murder trial. And very helpfully, it came from The Times, which he now owns. So I said, well, you can go and do your story, you can go and check it out. And then he really enjoyed, we had a sequence. I really believe that theatre, especially theatre about politics, which can often be very cerebral and dry, should have a theatrical punch to it. And we had an amazing set designer. And we tried to recreate the incredible way in which a newspaper was made even only 40 years ago, which is like something out of Lord of the Rings. It's very industrial, and it had hot metal, so and you have to hit the stone with a hammer, and the lava pours down. And so we had all this stuff, and he really enjoyed that. He found that quite romantic and nostalgic. That was, I mean, he was very sort of polite, and he enjoyed meeting the cast. He enjoyed meeting Bertie Carvel, who played him. There was one little sting at the end of the meeting, because I sort of tried to get in touch with him, but I didn't try too hard, I think it's fair to say, because I didn't know if it would be helpful, and there was so much public information in the public domain already about him, and I wanted it to do well, and then him to trust it first, rather than me go and him get worried about it. And he was fine. But at the very end, after being very polite, I was leading him out the fire exit, and he turned to me and said, oh, and by the way, next time you write something about me, and then just paused. So I said, ask you first? And he just went, yeah, and got into his car. And I was like, oh, Rupert, the first 29 minutes of that 30-minute meeting was lovely, and then you come and punch me in the... But I think he was being mischievous, but it was... and maybe I will, maybe I won't.
That performance by Bertie Carvel was magnificent. I mean, are you sometimes, I imagine this happens a lot, when you write words, they take on a completely different complexion, and I assume an actors can go sort of 20% beyond what you intended, or 10%. To what extent are you involved in the production, saying, hold on a minute, that's you're going to be a bit carried away here?
Yeah, dial it down. Very little. In theatre, because certainly in Britain, the culture is that theatre is a writer's medium. In Europe, it's a director's medium. And then you have film and television, which is an actor and a director's medium. So you probably can't really say who wrote your favourite film, but you normally can your favourite play. Your name is slightly above the door, and the process of a theatre production is often centred around you and the process of getting a fair version of your play made. So you're in rehearsals all the time in 4 or 5 weeks, and it's kind of glorious. But it's a collaboration, and you have to hand it over. So I would never give a note directly to an actor. That would be bad form. But you speak to the director afterwards, and it's the director's job to try and accompany people towards that. So sometimes, of course, you will watch an actor interpret a part and go, no, if I could say something now, I would. But generally speaking, in terms of the balance, for every one moment, I think, that you think, I don't think that's quite right, there are 6 or 7 that you would never have thought of. And I have great admiration for the skill of acting. It's furiously hard. It's both technical and emotional. It's very vulnerable. You get to, on opening night, never turn up again and go off and start the next thing, and they have to go night after night after night in front of the audience telling that story. So I love it for that reason. I love the collaborative nature of theatre, and it's why I could never give up theatre for glossy TV and film, because writing those is much more solitary. And in a film, you might not even turn up on set. Sometimes you might not meet the actors. You email the script, and to a lesser or greater extent, I will then see it when you see it. Whereas the muscular process of building a play as a company is just really thrilling.
Well, that's a good segue to move into Brexit, which was a film, or was a TV thing, and is sort of different from the things we've talked about so far because it's still happening. It's not history. It's not 3 years before you're born. And so tell us a bit about the origin of that and whether this dilemma of writing about something that was still, as we speak, we still don't know what's going to happen. What was it? How did it come about, and did you have any qualms about plunging into that
No, I'm
subject?
afraid I was quite naive about it. And what ended up being or feeling quite controversial and quite noisy with the question continually sort of asked in the media or to me around the film was, is it too soon? It's a completely valid question on a case-by-case basis. When is it too soon to start representing these things in art? It didn't really occur to me at the time. I started thinking about doing a film about the campaign a couple of weeks after the vote, because coming from a playwriting and theatre background, you would be absolving responsibility as a so-called political playwright to not be tackling the biggest issue of a generation. And actually, theatres, for that reason, are given public money to do that, to try and find ways to engage with the world and get people together in a space to look at it and ask questions. But I get that TV and it being a more populist medium and it reaching more people and being more mainstream, that this felt more provocative and controversial than I admit I thought it was when I started doing it. It came from a desire to understand that campaign. Just that I realised at the end of it, I'd not been paying attention to all the detail. I realised I didn't know how you run a referendum campaign in the 21st century. It came slightly from the moment when Joe Cox was murdered. Similarly to my analogy of the ambulances in New Palace Yard, you look at a moment and how incomprehensible it was that a member of Parliament might lose their life because of a democratic exercise like a referendum. The question presents itself in the world saying, well, what went wrong? What went wrong for that? That is a failure of something. So I really wanted to get under the skin of the referendum and the legacy of what feels like an incredibly divided, polluted, toxic, unhappy nation. Started doing it.
So again, you're not short of great characters,
No.
And a conventional way would have been to take one of those great characters. You could have taken Nigel Farage or Boris or Michael Gove or Aaron Banks. I mean, there's very prominent figures you could have dramatised, instead of which you went for a bloke most people had never heard of.
Yeah, so Dominic Cummings, who ran the Vote Leave campaign, I'd managed, and I pride myself on spending time following politics. I know by the time it got to the vote and then winning, I'd never heard of him pretty much either. These are strategists behind the scenes who are making decisions, but it's the public-facing politicians who we associate with those campaigns and those messages. So for the exact same reason that I looked at the whips in the 70s rather than Ted Heath and Margaret Thatcher, I find it satisfying and more surprising and interesting for an audience to put people centre stage who we're less familiar with. I also happen to think it's true that these people had greater influence on the nature of that campaign than Boris Johnson or Michael Gove. I don't mean to diminish the impact or importance of members of Parliament, but it was Dominic Cummings who came up with the slogan, "Take Back Control." It was Dominic Cummings who came up with the £350 million on the bus. It was Dominic Cummings and his team who decided how to target those messages, on what platforms, how much money you spend of the budget, what the tone and the timbre of that campaign is, that ended up also being reflected in the Donald Trump campaign. So it feels right to me.
And you met him?
Yep, eventually.
And he was happy to meet you and talk to you?
I wouldn't say he was happy to meet me at first, but he...
How did you win his trust?
It came through It came quite late, so it was about a year into the draft, and we were already moving into production, and we'd already cast Benedict Cumberbatch in his part before I'd actually met him. It was a mutual acquaintance that had seen some of my plays and sort of thankfully believed that I was a writer who tried to be fair and reasonable, and convinced him, you may as well come and have a chat. So what's remarkable, and I take the responsibility of this very seriously, is he is somebody who, for various reasons, hadn't really given any interviews since the result. He'd rejected most journalistic approaches to him, bar one, and very famously, the House of Commons, a select committee had asked for him to come and testify before them, and he'd refused to do that. His argument would be that he doesn't trust those instruments to get the truth out of him, and it's all theatre and it's all nonsense, and we could agree or disagree. So actually, there were questions that he hadn't answered, and he'd rejected normal forms of being held to account. So I'm thrilled and grateful and honoured and confused that he chose a playwright. And again, to your point about what is your responsibility and should you do it, if for whatever reason it is the artists who get access to these people, when they're more reticent to speak to journalists, then you have a responsibility to ask those questions and put that voice on stage. So we had a couple of meetings, again, for a reason that I'm very embarrassed about. We met in a neutral space, a friend's house, and he brought some of his team, the Vote Leave team. There was about 8 of the key people who ran that campaign in one space. Again, they'd never collectively given an interview and answered these questions. And we got some pizza in, and they gave me loads and loads of wine, and we were talking till 3 a.m. And then I woke up the morning after with a hangover, and my flawless system of not writing anything down and recording failed because I couldn't remember a single thing, literally a single thing that they had said. But what I did remember was the feel of the group, the dynamic, how they spoke to each other, the atmosphere, the tone of their banter, and particularly his character and his manner. So then, thankfully, he let me go back to his house later and actually answer some questions. And I introduced Benedict Cumberbatch to him, and they had a meeting. So he wasn't a consultant. He never got paid. He never saw the script. We never showed it to him. He never asked. He never saw a screening of it before broadcast, but he was happy to contribute his thoughts.
And how much did you rewrite the draft, having met him and having had those conversations?
Not a huge amount, because I'd done enough research to get a feel for it, but certain the way he expressed certain things. And then the main issue was data and technology, and he helped me understand at least his interpretation of why the use of data in that campaign wasn't necessarily monstrous or controversial, and again, people can disagree, but his view on how he used this system he built to collate data and how he targeted messages was helpful to get his perspective.
So we had, in this space on Tuesday, we had Carol Cadwallader, the Observer journalist, who's been doing a lot of the work about that particular referendum, and she was quite upset with some aspects of the play when she saw it. And
yes.
So one of the things she said is, we live in a post-truth society. What we desperately need is facts.
Yes.
And here you come along and write fiction, and that's not helpful.
Yes, and obviously I politely disagree. And I respect Carol enormously, and we went on quite a journey together because it's very fair to say that she was very worried for absolutely genuine reasons, having spent and fought for years to get this information out at some personal cost. And I could totally see why she then sees me and Benedict Cumberbatch coming along and doing what probably felt like quite a cynical exercise and an opportunistic one over something that is very dangerous and very delicate. So I totally understand it. I have to disagree. I have to disagree that art exists in opposition to the truth. It never has. It's just a different way of accessing information. And I'm going to get very pompous now, but obviously I care very strongly about this. This has been happening for 2,000 years, and actually, if I were to be very cheeky, I might propose that it's in fact theatre 2,000 years ago that created the conditions for which democracy and even journalism can exist. It was a festival theatre in ancient Greece in 532, check that, BC, that for the first time ever you got these disparate tribes together into one space to look at plays and tragedies. And it was 40 years or so later, that because of the infrastructure and the systems that were created around getting warring tribes into a physical space, that what we now recognise as democracy was invented. So pompous as that sounds, I feel very keenly the responsibility of theatre, and the right of theatre and drama and storytelling and narrative, to contribute something where it can to moments of national crisis, and to invite an audience to read the newspaper, go on Twitter, by all means, but also every now and again clock out of that and experience this in a different way. And audiences are intelligent enough to know that not everything I'm saying is necessarily completely based on fact. I will have conflated 6 meetings into one meeting, and I am imagining what people say when they close the door. But I don't think that means it's a lie or that it's fake news. But it's a really, really important debate, and I'm glad that she raised it, about the responsibilities and what is helpful and what is unhelpful in your method of presentation. And, so eventually, despite some reasonably public hostility on Twitter between the two of us, which we both regret, I invited to come and see a screening before anybody else, before it was broadcast. And I don't think she would mind me saying we had quite an emotional meeting where we both felt the exhaustion of our faux war, Cold War online, and tried to sort of reconcile. And we will never necessarily completely agree about what was right or wrong about the film and the choices I made about what to show. Fundamentally, she wishes I'd shown certain things and not shown other things, and we can have that debate. But the point is, and what I find exciting about it, is we have that debate. And when we actually had that debate in public, so I invited her to come and basically sort of yell her anger at me and put it in print and say, these are the list of things I think you've got wrong and why I think it's irresponsible. And my responsibility is to sit there and take it, and then offer my points of view, put that up online. And I was very happy to do that. And I directed all of my audience members to follow her on the night so that she could live stream all the things she hated about my drama, because that's really, really important. And again, without promoting it too much, I think what I am proud of, and even Carol sort of admitted at the end, after we'd made up, and she said, this probably is a helpful thing to do, because it just reaches a wider audience for things that ultimately sometimes dense investigative pieces might not. And I'm really proud, and she expressed gratitude that in a mainstream drama at 9 o'clock on Channel 4 that my mum and my auntie will watch by millions of people, with a Hollywood star in it, that we got to say the words aggregate IQ several times throughout the night. I think that's quite important, and I hope quite impressive, and the responsibility of a state broadcaster to do that. Also, finally, I also think it's the responsibility of a playwright to sometimes be a bit irresponsible and to be a bit dangerous. Artists shouldn't always play it safe, and if you get it wrong, you get held to account, as I feel like I have been frequently over this, and that's correct and that's right, and you should be scrutinised. But as well as going, I think we should be nice to politicians and I think we should be nice to Rupert Murdoch, I also have a responsibility to be a bit reckless and dangerous, as art always has.
Can you talk a bit about, as we're talking about the truth, and the tension that some people thought in that work between the highly researched bit, so you'd had your nose in Tim Shipman and reading Cummings's blog, and then you go around and you want to get all the facts exactly right about that strand of the story. And yet you have a sort of carry-on film happening at the same time, which is these buffoons, Farage and Banks and Johnson, who are played as sort of clowns. So you've got sort of two types of film in one. One is highly researched, and the other is caricature. Did that worry you? Were you conscious of that? You must have been conscious of it.
Slightly conscious, a bit worried. I'm not saying I necessarily got the representation of the politicians right. Some of it involves choices by actors and directors. There was a deliberate choice from all of us as a team to try and create something unapologetically entertaining, and actually to try and reflect in the tone and the aesthetic of the film the quite anarchic, quite punchy and quite punky feel of that referendum, which was, have you watched Aaron Banks? It's often very brash and broad and bullish, and we wanted to kind of reflect that. I would argue, my intellectual argument for it would be that, well, creatively, I enjoyed the tension between the realism of the special advisors and the policy wonks and the strategists contradicted with the public-facing MPs because it makes this bit seem more real. I would also argue, to an extent, that Nigel Farage and Boris Johnson and Aaron Banks are themselves caricatures that they play. They are characters that they've sort of invented and go out and ruffle their hair and do all that, and they are sort of performing themselves. And I would like to think it's possibly a comment on that slightly. I also just think I wanted it to be fun and funny. And I didn't want to write a really, really, really earnest, worthy version of a very serious moment in our time because I wanted a mainstream audience to be able to enjoy it.